Hello, my name is Stan. Welcome to Flying for Money. We're going to be doing a little bit of a different one here today. We're going to put on the virtual reality headset. We're going to step into the ATR 72-500, the aircraft that was involved in the accident a few months ago, the Voepass Flight 2283 crash, which claimed the lives of 62 people. As a pilot in command, you are responsible for the lives of those 62 people. The second in command, the first officer, is there to facilitate the pilot in command, to challenge the pilot in command when the pilot command is making decisions they don't agree with or they think is outside of what they're supposed to be doing operationally. And so before we get into it, in the last video that I did, I had several complaints about, I guess, the feeling that I was being judgmental towards these pilots. I think that ultimately they made some very poor decisions, exercised some very bad judgment throughout the flight, particularly when they received an airframe de-icing caution message. Airframe de-icing was not available. They were operating in icing conditions. The first item on the abnormal checklist for an airframe de-ice malfunction is to exit and avoid icing conditions. They did not do that. And I have a serious problem with that. That is very poor judgment. I don't understand how that could happen. I mean, I have some idea. They're pilots in Brazil. They may not experience as much ice as we would up in more northern latitudes. So I can sort of understand, but I don't get it from the background of training, how this was not emphasized to them. The SNIPA report indicates that there was ice training for the ATR-72. It would be really shocking if that wasn't emphasized as a serious safety issue. The ATR-72 doesn't have a perfect record in icing conditions. They do have some fatal accidents and some close calls. At the end of the day, maybe the training was bad. There's some people felt that may have been the case. The ATR-72 is a bit of a handful in ice. Really, any turboprop is a handful in ice. There's not a lot of large transport category turboprops out there. The ATR-72 is pretty much, I mean, it's the main one that's in service right now as far as large turboprops. There are plenty of smaller turboprops that have icing issues, but you generally don't hear about it at the large mass public level because there's a handful of fatalities in those. When you have a 62-person fatality crash, it gets the media's attention. And so this is something that really afflicts all turboprops just because of the altitudes that they operate at, the type of missions that they have. They're generally shorter duration, which means that they climb to lower altitudes. They operate at lower altitudes, and they do have the tendency to have this de-ice boot system as opposed to heated leading edges of the wings. The de-ice boot system is effective, but it's not perfect. You have to allow ice to accumulate before you activate the boots. And in these modern systems, they tell you to activate the boot as soon as you get an alert in the cockpit. It'll be an icing message. They have what are called ice detectors, which are just vanes that vibrate at a certain frequency. When ice accumulates on that vane, it changes the frequency. That triggers an alert to the cockpit saying, hey, you're accumulating ice. Turn on the de-ice system. So that's what they had aboard the ATR-72. As long as the crew aren't doing certain things, it's a safe aircraft in icing, as long as you don't operate it under certain conditions. So there was in Roselawn years and years ago, there was an ATR-72 crash in icing. They were in severe icing. They had extended the flaps in the hold because they didn't like, at the speed they were at, it kind of gave an increased pitch, a deck angle that the pilots didn't like. So they put flaps in to decrease that. They accumulated a lot of ice. They accumulated ice aft of the de-ice boots. Ultimately, it disrupted the airflow of the ailerons, which caused them to lose control of the aircraft because they didn't have good aileron authority. The ailerons were actually sort of based upon that aerodynamics. They were going hard over, and they were experiencing quite a bit of force, at least 22 pounds. That's all I can measure off of the flight data recorder at the yoke. It was in excess of 22 pounds, could have been significantly more, 50, 60 pounds. And ultimately, the aircraft, the yoke just kind of yanked them into a spin and a crash. But as it relates to Voepass, I did want to emphasize up front that this isn't a blame game type of a situation. This isn't about let's find someone to pin the tail on. Let's blame the pilots. Let's be judgmental. Let's say that they were idiots. I don't think they were idiots. I think they were actually probably pretty fair pilots. But for some reason, they just overlooked something that's very, very serious in the ATR-72, which is icing encounter, and in particular, going into ice with de-ice equipment aboard the aircraft that is not functioning. Exit and avoid ice. It's the first item on the checklist that they should have run when they got the message alerting them to the fact that the airframe de-ice was inoperative. And then they made a couple of major mistakes after that. And again, maybe some of this comes down to training. To the airframe a little bit, although I think ATR really solved a lot of the de-ice issues they had. They extended the ice boots back further along the leading edges of the wings so that the Roselawn situation wouldn't occur again. And then they introduced an advanced stall warning system, which is a pretty interesting sort of approach. Although I said in the previous video that I did, the first stage of it, which is a cruise speed alert, it really is stating that you haven't obtained the cruise speed the computer thinks you should based upon your weight and your thrust setting. You'd probably get this cruise speed alert, which is a 10% degradation in airspeed. There are situations where you could get that alert, probably that had nothing to do with ice. So possibly they ignored that alert because they were used to ignoring it. However, they knew they had bad de-ice equipment, and they knew that they were in icing conditions. So the fact that they didn't take that alert seriously, and then the ensuing alert, which told them that they were degrading even further, is pretty problematic. It's very clear, and this happened in the Roselawn case as well, where the pilots obviously didn't take the icing situation they were in seriously. They didn't identify that they were in severe ice. And that I can actually understand. I've been in icing before that I realized afterwards, a decade afterward, was probably severe icing. At the time, we didn't recognize it as severe ice. We landed the aircraft. As we were taxiing in, I told the first officer, hey, you got to let him know we were in ice. And he went and reported light ice. I said, no. That's moderate ice. We got out of the aircraft. We inspected the airframe afterwards. We were in severe icing there. And I didn't recognize it, and the first officer definitely didn't recognize it. As a pilot in a turboprop, it's actually not that easy. We can say severe icing. We can tell you the definition of severe icing, but identifying it from the flight deck in flight is actually more difficult than you might think. And that was the reason for the Voepass advanced sort of ice alert system, is that it tells you from a performance standpoint, hey, you may be in severe icing. When you trigger these alerts, you may be in severe icing. Now, the final alert that they got, degraded airspeed alert, occurred about the same time as they got the stick shaker. There's an airframe vibration that was heard in the cockpit voice recorder. That was probably the stick shaker firing. Stall alert system activated, which would be the stick shaker. It just vibrates the yoke to simulate airframe buffet to tell you that you're in a stall condition. And then 10, 12, 14 seconds later, they ultimately lost control of the aircraft. So they didn't respond appropriately to that sort of initial phase stall alert. They also allowed airspeed to degrade significantly below what they should have if they had recognized they were in severe icing conditions, which would have been icing bug plus 30 knots. In this case, I think it would have been 195 knots. Icing bug was 165 knots. And they had degraded inside of that boundary. So this is a situation where they did not recognize that they were in severe icing conditions for whatever reason. But they did recognize, we know that they did recognize that they had airframe de-icing failure. And you really can't just let them walk past that. That's going to be the major component as it comes to the final sort of cause of the accident. The probable cause of the accident will be continued operation into icing conditions, which is in conflict with the de-ice, airframe de-ice failure checklists instruction to avoid icing conditions and to exit icing conditions. They had opportunity potentially with air traffic control to say, you got to give us a lower altitude. We're collecting ice. We have an airframe de-ice system failure. We need to descend. They didn't do that. They stayed at 17,000 feet. And this was after almost an hour of cruise with that system failed in what would be considered de-icing conditions. They probably weren't collecting ice over that entire time, but they were in icing conditions. They just kept trucking in the icing conditions, didn't communicate with anyone. We don't have any indication that they really had a significant conversation between the captain and the first officer over it. And so this is pilot error. It's going to be pilot error. We do need to find out why that happened and to ensure that that doesn't happen in the future. But as it relates to the pilots, this isn't about being judgmental to the pilots. Anyways, I wanted to emphasize that before we went on. I did actually state that at the end of the last video that I did, but there were a number of commenters that felt like I was being substantially too harsh on the pilots. A little bit of hot blood down south as it relates to who's to blame for this. There's a sense that it's sort of the big corporations that are blamed for it. It's ATR is to blame for it. The company, Voepass itself, the airline is to blame for it. It's possible that they might attribute some of the blame to each of these entities. I really do think the ATR 72. I mean, would I feel comfortable with my family on an ATR 72 going in icing conditions, as long as the pilots were trained appropriately, as long as it was emphasized to them how serious icing is, as long as they understood that it can be very difficult to identify severe icing when you encounter it. You may not really be able to tell that from where you're sitting, and that they have the systems that you need to take very seriously. If you get ice alerts, you get these speed alerts, the degraded speed certainly, and then the cruise speed alerts. If you're in icing conditions, you need to take that seriously. You need to add increments. They have two different increments, which is icing bug, and then you have the icing bug plus 30. You should tend towards icing bug plus 30. If you can't maintain icing bug plus 30 when you're in icing conditions, something's wrong. You need to maintain the airspeed. You need to descend. You need to declare an emergency. If this stuff isn't there within the training programs, they need to fix that. And it's quite possible that it isn't. And to the degree that these pilots lost their lives, obviously not being as aware as they should have been about the dangers of icing condition, you can relieve a little bit of that from them. You can put it on the shoulders of training departments and on the shoulders of ATR potentially in terms of not reinforcing that. But anyways, we're going to move on. Just a couple things before we get in there. So PIC, SIC. So PIC is captain, SIC is the first officer. PIC had 5,248 hours of total time. SIC, first officer, had 5,143. So these guys were pretty comparable as far as total time, total experience. In the past 30 days, the captain had almost 60 hours of flight time. First officer only had 2.5 hours. And that 2.5 hours had come in the previous 24 hours. So the first officer, they really don't specify any longer than that. We don't know how long the first officer had sort of been out of service. Was he out of service for 2 months, for 3 months, for 4 months, for 5 months? Was he just coming back after an extended absence? I mean, when you're not recent on an aircraft, that does affect how well you're going to perform in your particular seat. So he didn't have a lot of experience in the past 30 days. 2.5 hours isn't much. If I go away, I have 10,000 hours flight time. I've been a check airman and instructor. I have a lot of experience. If I go away for 60 hours, even if I'm working in a sim, and then I come back, 30, 35 days, I haven't actually flown an airplane. Even though I've been in a simulator, doing simulator stuff, if I haven't flown an airplane, I'm pretty rough after 30-some days. I'm going to be a little bit slower. So I don't know how much of a factor that played in this particular accident. And as it relates to total time on the aircraft, the PIC had 665 hours, almost 666 hours. I don't think that means anything, but the SIC first officer had 3,543 hours. So the first officer had a lot of experience in that type of aircraft, should have known the ATR-72 very well. The captain had enough experience. 600 and almost 700 hours is pretty good experience in an aircraft, but likely, we don't know if this was his first upgrade, if he had just been a captain for 600-something hours. It's not a ton of experience. Certainly the first officer had more experience in the aircraft, but he also had much less recency. So as it related to their response to being in icing conditions, it could explain why the captain maybe didn't take that as seriously as he should have, and the first officer just, for whatever reason, kind of let it go. He's just getting reacclimated with the aircraft itself. So anyways, we're going to get into the virtual reality headset just so I can move around the flight deck a little bit. We're actually going to run the recreation. These are going to be the exact data points from ADS-B, which is what gets transmitted to ATC from the aircraft so that ATC can track the aircraft. So this is the exact flight trajectory of the aircraft. We're going to have similar weather conditions, and then we can talk a little bit about what happened. We can talk about some of the poor decisions that they made, why they're definitively poor, why they were bad judgment, kind of inexcusable. I'm sure there's a reason for it. It is not a blame game, but it's not the sort of thing that you should do in this sort of aircraft in any sort of environment. So let's jump into it. All right, so we're aboard the ATR 72. This is actually the Dash 600. You can tell the difference between the Dash 500 and Dash 600 by this main paddle. One of the big differences in this particular flight would be this section right here. So this section is the checklist. It's an electronic checklist. Now, they wouldn't have had this in the Dash 500 that they were flying. Any of those sort of abnormal messages would populate the corresponding checklist on the Dash 600s, and so it's very easy to do the checklist. Kind of hard to screw it up. In this situation, you can see they're starting to enter the cloud bases here in the simulation. So what they would have done, and what they actually did do, is they turned on the propeller de-ice when you're entering into icing conditions. You wait for the wings until you get an ice detector, until you note that you've started to accumulate ice. The wing de-ice is right here, so you would select that on, and this is where they got the fault. So they select it on, and then you see the fault message there. And they flew a good portion of the flight with it in that condition, with that light out, but with an icing alert message. Actually turning the wing de-ice off when you have that fault is the second item in the airframe de-ice fault checklist. The first item is exit and avoid icing conditions. Exit and avoid icing conditions. The first thing you do is exit and avoid icing conditions. They didn't do that. The captain has this little thing right here, which is, it doesn't do anything. It's just a little sort of aerodynamic protrudence in the slipstream. And if you're in icing conditions, that just accumulates ice. So that's a way to look over and say, hey, we've accumulated ice. You could also, in the daytime, you can look at the windshield wiper arms. You collect some ice there. You can see this element here is, that's a heating element for the side windows. You can see underneath it. So everything inside there is going to be protected against ice, going to be heated, but below it along the edges it wouldn't. So the first officer at a certain point made a comment, hey, we're picking up a lot of ice. He was either referencing there where he saw a lot of ice, or he was referencing on his side, the windshield wiper arm, where he saw ice. I'm not totally thrilled with ATR's decision to only put the ice indicator on the captain's side. That's really command and control stuff. It is what it is, but it would have been better if it had been somewhere up in the middle of the aircraft. The Airbus actually has it right up here. It's just a little probe that sticks off of the center post outside the aircraft. So either the first officer or the captain can identify that icing is taking place. But these guys, both of them, knew that icing was taking place. They knew that the airframe de-ice system had failed, and they had shut that off when they got the fault. They shut it off. Per the checklist, it doesn't appear they referred to the checklist. You know, if it was a 600 and they did have the electronic checklist set up, they just would have seen all the stages here, and the first one would have said icing conditions, exit and avoid. Pretty hard to ignore, and they should have known that. Even if they didn't refer to the checklist, they should have known, hey, we shouldn't be flying in icing conditions with a piece of de-ice equipment that has failed. So you see you got a master caution down here. It says icing, and you can see that. If you can't, that's what it says. It says icing, and that means, hey, you're in icing conditions and you don't have any, you're not properly configured, which is to say that you do not have the wing de-ice on. And you can see in this case, the icing message remains, and it's not going to go away until you select the proper configuration. Turn that on, bang, icing message goes away. So that's how that works. So they turned it on, and then they got the fault message up there. They turned it back off. Once they got the fault message, took a minute, about a minute for that fault message to enunciate. And then they got the icing message several times. I think it was 5 times en route, something like 7 times total. So, and then here we go. You know, this is what happens if you're in icing conditions. Once you turn off the wing, it's going to re-trigger the system. So after so long, a minute or two, that's going to re-engage. And so that's exactly what happened to them. They just kept getting that message. They would clear it, and then it would pop up again, and they would clear it. And it was just kind of on and off during the flight. And these ice probes, how they work, they vibrate at a specific frequency. If ice accumulates, it changes the frequency of that vibration, and then that triggers the ice alert. And once the ice alert has been triggered, that probe will be heated electronically. It'll melt whatever ice is on the probe off, and then it'll reset the system. And then if it detects ice again, it'll trigger that same message. So if it melts it off and doesn't detect ice, the icing message will go away. And then after a while, it gets in icing conditions again. It accumulates ice again. The frequency changes, and then that message will come up again. So I got that 5 times over an hour. Didn't do anything. Didn't think about diverting. Didn't think about Getting in the box, I assume they have A cars. You can go and send messages, text messages to dispatch to Operation Center and say, hey, we have wing de-ice fail, we have airframe de-ice fail. Is it good where we're going? Should we get to a different altitude? Do we need to turn around and go back? But you can always communicate with your dispatcher there who would have had that information available to look at and say, what are the PIREPs, which would be pilot reports, or AirMets, which is meteorological reports for airmen. You've got moderate to severe ice, so you're obviously not going to want to take this airplane in there. We don't know exactly how much time they would have been in the clouds and icing conditions here. It appears as though it was over most of the route that they had this overcast layer. Anytime you're in visual conditions and it's below freezing, there, of course, is the opportunity for ice to develop on the airframe. Should talk a little bit. There was what's called an MEL, minimum equipment list item on the aircraft. That is a dispatchable piece of equipment that's failed, which means that you can fly the aircraft for a certain period of time without various components being functional on board the aircraft. In this particular case, it was what they call a PAC. It stands for Pneumatic Air Conditioning Kit, PACK. It is powered by high-pressure bleed air. And pretty much all turbine pack systems, there's two different bleed systems that they can be powered off of. In low engine thrust or engine power operations, there's a high pressure bleed that'll power that pack. And then in higher engine power settings, there's a low pressure bleed. And the bleed is just, it's a valve within the compressor of the engine itself that taps some of the high pressure air out of that system to power various components. Here, principally, it powers the pressurization system and the air conditioning system, and then also the de-ice boots. It helps to inflate the de-ice boots. On this particular flight, the number one pack was inoperative, and that number one pack system, in general, that's going to provide pressurization air conditioning to the flight deck. The flight deck can also borrow off the number two system if it has to. Number two system principally provides air conditioning and pressurization to the main cabin. So the bleeds, the reason we call it air conditioning is because you have to cool the bleed air, even though it's very cold at high altitudes. The bleed air is extremely hot coming out of the engine. And compressed air, not only is it highly pressurized, which allows you to power the pack system, but it's also very hot. So you got to air condition it before you deliver it to the cabin in order to get it to a useful temperature. So number one pack system was an op on this flight. That limited the flight via Voepass and somewhat of ATR limitations to 17,000 feet. Which is a factor in what happened here, because 17,000 feet was a pretty bad altitude on this day for them to be limited to, because that was where probably the highest concentration of icing was. If they'd been able to go higher, likely they would have been outside of the icing conditions, and then on the way into their destination, Sao Paulo, they could have simply descended through the ice on the way in and instead of trucking around in the ice for an extended period of time. So that is a factor. In climb and cruise, the low pressure provides plenty of energy to run the pack in a descent or idle taxi on the ground. When the engines aren't spinning as fast, you need the high pressure air in order to run that pack. De-ice system itself is run off of a high pressure bleed. So we don't know this. We know this pack was MEL'd. We don't know if that is potentially was a misdiagnosis, that they were getting a pack fault message in low power settings. Don't know if the pilots passed that along to maintenance. If they did, if maintenance figured out that, hey, this may not be a pack fault, this may be a high pressure bleed fault. That can happen. Don't know if that's the case here. Don't know if investigators will be able to figure it out. They'll sift through the wreckage and they'll try to see if all the components were working properly. Impact damage can affect their ability to do that. They may not be able to, the component may be damaged beyond the point of them figuring out whether it was functional or not. If there was a problem with the high pressure system, they MEL'd the pack. You wouldn't have seen that issue again until you got into ice, and then you triggered your wing de-ice system on. And when you did that, if the high pressure system was having some issues, that could trigger a fault because one side would maybe not be getting de-iced properly. So you can see here, Microsoft Flight Sim, you look out, hey, look, yep, we're accumulating some ice. It's cold. You can see the wings. accumulating ice. This is actually pretty close to what it looks like in a boot system where you have inflatable boots that break ice off after it's accumulated. You generally don't break all of the ice off when you inflate the boots. There's generally little patches that don't get blown off, so you never really get rid of all of the ice. Here we go, icing, boom. Again, this is just exactly what they would have gotten in the flight. So they get the icing message, and that would indicate, hey, you need to turn your wing on. There's a potential in this failure, whatever caused the fault, it could be just one side had faulted, one side wasn't clearing ice and the other side was. That's actually the worst possible scenario. So later on in the flight, when they started picking up substantial ice, they would start getting nervous, clearly say, hey, we're picking up a lot of ice. They'd say, well, let's go back and let's just go ahead and turn that thing on again. Let's give it another shot, right? The checklist doesn't tell you to do that. It says turn it off, exit and avoid icing. And what you need to know as a pilot is why you don't want to turn that thing back on. And that's if one side's working and the other isn't. Now you have asymmetric icing on the airframe, which is the worst possible. It's the most dangerous sort of scenario that you can run into. Because with asymmetric icing, one wing is losing lift. It's having increased drag. It'll stall at an advanced angle of attack. And the other wing is not, because it's been cleared and clean. And so if you get a little bit slow, one wing will stall well in advance of the other, which will cause the aircraft to roll and enter into a spin. And if you throw a bunch of thrust to try to recover from the spin, multi-engine aircraft, particularly with the pack in op on one side, the bleeds will actually pull power from the engine in order to run the pack itself, the air conditioning system. It takes energy to do that. And so it kind of robs that energy from one side of the aircraft to do that. And so the left engine with that pack MEL'd, non-operable, the left engine was producing something like 6 to 8% more power than the right engine. So if you cob both thrust levers trying to recover from the stall spin, you would end up in the flat spin that they wound up in. You'd have more power on the left side, and it would cause you to rotate clockwise, which is where what initially happened to them. This obviously didn't help them out. This MEL potentially didn't help them out if they had misdiagnosed this, if mechanics had, and you have to give the mechanics a little bit of a break, depending upon how it was written up. If it was just written up fault left pack, they would just MEL left pack. If it was fault left pack only with reduction in power, they may have had an opportunity to think, hey, that may be a high-pressure bleed, because that's when the high-pressure bleeds will kick on. When you reduce thrust, the high-pressure bleed will take over the pack. If it's only failing in that state, then it may be a different issue. And if it's a high-pressure bleed issue, you are not going to be able to dispatch this aircraft into icing conditions at all. It's kind of suspicious that this happened on this flight, this sort of failure, but it could have been something else as well. Irregardless, from the pilot's standpoint, you're not going to turn your wing de-ice on when you have a fault in that system because of the serious risk of asymmetric de-icing. So they made two big mistakes here. The first, when they got the message in the first place, you're supposed to pull that book out, flip to the right page, run the procedure. Item 1 in that procedure is going to be exit and avoid icing conditions. If they just followed that, exit and avoid icing conditions, none of this would have happened. If they got up there and they're like, well, we don't see too much ice right now, but we need to know what we need to do, then go ahead and contact dispatch. Do that through ACARs if they had ACARs. If not, there are frequencies that you can tune, and they would give you a telephone connection over the radio to dispatcher. And then you could just have a verbal conversation saying, hey, here's the situation. What's it look like where we're going? And then dispatch could look it up and say, yeah, we've got all these reports of serious ice over your destination. That's not a good place to be taking this aircraft. Let's send it back to your point of origin. Let's just turn around, go back there, get it on the ground. It's going to be an inconvenience for the passengers, but they'll be safe. And then we can figure out where to go from there. So unfortunately, they didn't do that. And 58 passengers killed, both pilots, 2 flight attendants in the back, total of 62 people killed. I'm not sure why they didn't take the icing seriously. I mean, you can see what this is probably pretty similar to what they started to see, which is, hey man, we got a lot of ice on this thing. The other thing they didn't do, and they got nervous, they turned that on, which they shouldn't have done. But what they should have done is focus here on airspeed. And then they got a couple different messages. They got a cruise speed message, which would have been a blue message. This is a part of the advanced ice protection system. It's kind of a clever little system. Once you put that weight in, it's going to say, okay, what's your thrust set at, and what's our projected cruise speed at this weight, at this thrust, at this altitude, at this temperature. And if you're 10% below what it's calculating you should be at, it's going to say, hey, cruise speed, which really what it means is, hey, if you're in icing conditions, you may be accumulating ice to the extent that the drag is causing you to lose airspeed, which is what ice does. At 30%, it gives a more aggressive caution message. Says, you gotta check your speed. You're 30% below if you're in icing conditions. At that point in time, really what you need to do is maintain what they call icing bug plus 30. So icing bug on this flight, that's based on weight. Icing bug was 165 knots on this particular flight. Says do not decelerate below 195 knots, and they did. And they decelerated below 195 knots. When they did that, pretty soon after they did that, they got the stick shaker, which is a yoke. Both yokes would start rattling and shaking. It simulates an airframe buffet. It's a stall alert system. It's supposed to be before you've entered a stall. And at that point, it tells you, hey, you need to decrease pitch, you need to increase power, and you need to increase airspeed, basically. Decrease angle of attack, increase airspeed. And they got the stick shaker. It was about 12 seconds before they lost control of the aircraft. Apparently had a little bit of time to recover appropriately, but apparently they didn't do that. So that's kind of the third nail in the coffin. It's not a blame game. They obviously didn't appreciate how serious icing conditions are, especially in an ATR-72, which doesn't have the best history. ATR has done a lot to improve from a system standpoint, and if they have any sort of failure in the systems, get out of those icing conditions. These two pilots did not do that. When they got the failures, they didn't apparently run the checklist because they just kept resetting this. They didn't exit and avoid icing conditions. All that's really bad procedure. They didn't communicate with anyone, with dispatch or with operations. They didn't talk to anyone about it. It's unclear whether they talked to each other about it. And then when they got the stick shaker, the stall warning, they apparently didn't properly respond to that. Throughout all this, as they were getting the alerts, they were having airspeed degrade throughout those alerts below 195 knots. And they had the speed that they would have been safe at, which is 195 knots. And they should have known when they were getting those degraded speed warnings, hey, we're in icing conditions. This probably isn't a frivolous alert. This probably is a real alert. And they didn't respond appropriately to it, which is, okay, icing bug plus 30 knots, 195 knots. If we can't maintain that airspeed, we definitely are trucking around too much ice, and we need to descend. We need to maintain our airspeed, trade altitude, maintain airspeed, and as we get lower, particularly going anywhere in Brazil, as we get lower, eventually we're going to get to warmer weather, and we're going to melt whatever ice on that we've got on the airframe. They didn't do any of that, which is startling. It's disheartening. Again, thoughts and prayers to the families of everyone on board the aircraft, passengers and crew, the pilots. This isn't a thing where they deserved what they got, but coming from a background of instructor and check airman, there were several items here that would have been a failure on a check ride, and we don't fail people just for grins. We fail it because they've done something that would make me think, hey, if I saw them getting on an airplane, I wouldn't want to put my family on board with them. And that's what these guys did in this particular instance. So, again, thoughts and prayers to everyone this happened to. It had to be terrifying, the final moments when they're in that flat spin and they came out of the clouds and the forces, the centrifugal forces, and everyone on board had to know that this is really, really bad. And you look out the windows and everything's spinning and the ground's rushing up. And you know that's it. Your last several seconds, last minute, you know that this is the end of your life. So tragedy all around. Hopefully for those out there who are flying, who encounter any sort of icing conditions, this will help. You have to keep your speed up predominantly, and if you have any sort of icing equipment failure, don't fly in ice. And if you have that failure, don't freak out. Just fly fast and get somewhere, get on the ground somewhere, find a good place to go where you're not going to be encountering a bunch of ice. Anyways, thanks for joining. We'll see you next time.